Welcome to CropCast Conversations, a podcast that draws on experience and advice from people working in the arable industry and covering a range of interesting topics. I'm Mark Boucher-Gibbs, and I'll be here every other month with a new episode. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing industrial hemp.
Well, it's an extremely versatile crop, and I know some people call it a wonder crop. And I've got to agree, because how many other plants would you get a stem that can provide fibre and a pithy core, and also seeds and other products? So the list I've got here is you can get food from it, you can get oil for cooking or for salads, you can get biofuels, you can get construction materials, textiles, you can manufacture products from it, you can get animal bedding, horse and pet, you can do land remediation, and you can make paper from it.
My guest today is Iain Riddell, and Iain and I have been involved in the development of this crop for the last 2 or 3 years, so we thought it would be good to have a bit of a discussion and cover off some of the knowledge that we've gained. Good morning, Iain. How are you keeping?
Oh, grand, and thanks for inviting me along, Mark.
Very good. And a bit of background to yourself. Recently retired from SAC Consulting, but with a long career history with SAC.
Only 45 years.
Only 45 years. So, what were some of the highlights? I mean, your achievements have been many. What were the standout moments for you during your career with SAC?
I did loads of things. I mean, I started off in a farm manager position. I was an agricultural advisor. I worked with the specialists. I worked in management. I worked in a lot of projects, a lot of novel projects. But I've got to say, the hemp thing has been one of the most interesting things I've studied or looked into so far.
Yeah, we kicked off on this back in 2022, I think, wasn't it, with an initial report that was a privately funded report for Indie Nature in the Scottish Borders. And then you and I had some money from Scottish Enterprise, and we did a report working with farmers predominantly through 2024, and we learned quite a lot through that. So we'll pick up on some of that today and feedback. Before we get too far into the podcast, let's just perhaps recap and give listeners a overview of the potential uses for hemp as a industrial crop.
Well, it's an extremely versatile crop, and I know some people call it a wonder crop. And I've got to agree, because how many other plants would you get a stem that can provide fibre and a pithy core, and also seeds and other products? So the list I've got here is you can get food from it, you can get oil for cooking or for salads, you can get biofuels, you can get construction materials, textiles, you can manufacture products from it, you can get animal bedding, horse and pet, you can do land remediation, and you can make paper from it. And I've probably missed out a few things, but we'll come on to cover some of these later on in the conversation.
I suppose a kick-off point for the listeners is, what do we mean by industrial hemp? And the word to get out the way, first of all, is the THC content word, which is tetrahydrocannabinol.
Well done.
Right. So, when we're talking about industrial hemp, we're talking about hemp that has a THC content of 0.2. In Europe, I believe, in some countries in Europe, it's 0.3. What's the importance of the different THC content for growers that you're aware of?
I think what we're looking at here is we're trying to distinguish between an industrial crop, which can be used for a huge number of purposes, and a narcotic crop. And I believe narcotic crops, not that I know much about them, but they go from 5% up to 31% THC, whereas we're looking at an industrial crop, which they've tried to keep down at a safe level of 0.2%. But I mean, in France, it's 0.3% at the moment. So we're just trying to harmonize the standard for these crops.
Yeah, I think they're working on it, and then they've been lobbying to get the raise, and I think it's obviously got to go through all the legal channels. And I think if it was successful, then for growers here in the UK, it would open up the range of varieties that we would probably be able to grow. And I think it's important to note that in the UK currently, we are allowed to process stem and seed only, and not flower and leaf. And some countries in Europe can harvest the flower and leaf for CBD products, but here in the UK, we're limited to seed production and fibre production from the stem.
It's interesting, Mark, just to do a little bit of historical context here, because the crop was very widely grown, and it was back in 1928. It was banned in the UK along with a number of other countries because of the narcotic cannabis problem, and it's suffered from that stigma ever since, which has been really frustrating for people who wanted to get into the crop to grow it for industrial purposes. And it's only in recent years that that's come back. Interestingly, only one country didn't ban it, and that was France. And they've got quite a good network of hemp growing at the moment. I think it was primarily because they had a big paper making industry based through hemp. So yeah, it's just something that's coming back in. But I mean, what a crop! It has so many uses.
And historically, it was the predominantly for rope for the sailing industry, wasn't it? And especially up in Scotland.
Well, that's right. I think it was a really big crop. If we go right back, it's probably started off in China, and then it kind of migrated. It was taken across the Mediterranean, and then into Northern Europe. And it was a huge industry back in the 1700s because of sail ships. And it was mainly for cordage, for all the ropes. It was for sails, and they also used it as caulk as well. And if you look at why did they use hemp for the ropes, it's an immensely strong material. It's one of the strongest natural materials you can get. So it didn't break easily. It doesn't break down. It doesn't mold badly. It actually floats in water. And with the kind of gales that a lot of these ships were going around Cape Horn, and they needed the strongest sails they could get. So it was a huge thing. And there was actually decrees by Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in England for their people to grow more cannabis. This is small amounts of hemp being grown in back gardens and any plot of land they had. They mandated it at one time because they needed the rope and sail for the British Navy, which built the empire, as we all know. So there's quite a lot of history here. And that kind of died out. The growing of the crop died out by the early 1800s, maybe the 1700s as well, because Russia and the Baltic states grew so much, we started to import it. And there were factories that processed it here. So it hasn't really been grown in a large scale since these medieval years. And I've looked at Scotland as well, because everyone said it was previously grown in Scotland. I wanted to find some evidence of it. And there's not much, but there are farm names, like there's Hemp Rigs, and there's one of our border farmer growers had hemp seed Ford on the Tweed right beside his farm. So it has been grown here. There's references in Lewis and Dumfries and Galloway as well. And I've found the best evidence I found was a palynological study, which is an investigation of pollen and sediments of lakes or lochs in our case. And they did two studies in the 1990s in Fife, the Black Loch and Conquer Loch. And in the Black Loch, they found evidence of pollen grains suddenly came in, or pollen suddenly came in around 985 and then kind of disappeared. The concentration went down at 1270, and then it persisted a bit until 1460. And there's not much evidence after that. So, but it has been growing here, and there are fragments of materials, and we know it does grow in this country, because we've grown it in the borders recently. So there's an awful lot more I could say about the history of hemp, but it's not a foreign crop. It has been grown here in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned China. I think China account for sort of 35 to 40% of global output. In Europe, I think they're getting on to about 50,000 hectares. And you mentioned France. They are, yes, the biggest producer in Europe, and their cooperatives are sizable, aren't they? I mean, La Chanvre, I think, has probably 400 members and getting on for 15,000 hectares in that one group alone. And indeed, we visited the Netherlands and looked at some processes up there. So it's interesting when we are sort of working and trying to learn more about this crop to visit these European countries and find out really where they are and how they're processing and what they're growing. And we might come on to that if we've got time a bit later on. So we're talking about industrial hemp with a low THC. Should we just dive into the properties of the hemp crop in terms of the products that we're looking at in terms of fibre and shiv? Do you want to just perhaps give a bit of detail about what quantities of each we're likely to see if we're growing hemp for fibre?
Yes. So growing hemp for fibre, I think we should explain what that means compared to growing hemp for seed, because both are happening in Scotland at the moment. And the fibre crop is grown for as long stems as possible. There's two main components to the hemp crop. Once you lose the leaves, you've got a stalk. And around the outside of that stalk, you've got fibres, fairly fine but very strong fibres. And inside that fibre band, you've got a pithy core, which is known as shiv. And that can also be used for industrial purposes too. And when you actually process it and try and separate the fibre from the shiv, you end up with roughly 25% of your baled hemp will be fibre, and about 55 to 60% will be shiv, and the rest will be dust.
So, and we'll talk about a bit more about that when we talk about the sort of processing side of it once the crop leaves the field. So, in terms of what's currently going on in the UK, let's say, I mean, we've worked with Indonesia in the Scottish borders, and they've been on a business development plan for the last 15 years or so, and they are taking in hemp bales locally and both from Yorkshire to process the baled hemp for its fibre predominantly. Should we just give listeners an update as to the sort of UK activity per se? We've got Indonesia in the borders, but we've also got a couple of companies in Yorkshire. Do you want to give a bit of background as to, because we visited those, didn't we?
Yes, we did 2 years ago as part of our study. The issue we've got is we don't have the infrastructure in the UK, and it's very difficult to build factories because you need capital, you need machines, and we don't have that infrastructure yet. Where we're at the moment is there are a few companies who are growing hemp. East Yorkshire Hemp were probably one of the first. Nick Vos down near Driffield, one of the first to grow hemp in England. He's been at it for about 17 years now. And he's got an operation that involves his own hemp and a few other growers. It was probably around 400 acres, 500 acres, something like that. We've got Harrison Spinks, who we also visited, who are the bed maker, and they grow hemp and flax to put in their mattresses. And they had around 300 to 400 acres. There's a good hemp group down in the southwest. There's another Fibre, which is also, down that way. And you hear, the interesting thing about hemp is you hear about new businesses. Every week you hear about somebody different or something different that's happening. When we come back to Scotland, there isn't really a lot. I mean, the first Scottish hemp of recent times was the Scottish Hemp Association, where 10 members started to trial or grow it and trial it. And I was speaking to one of them the other day, and it's down to about 2 or 3 growers now.
And that was up in the Aberdeenshire group, was it?
Yeah, around about Aberdeenshire and Angus area. So there's small scale hectareages there, and we've grown 57 hectares in the borders last year. The second year it's been growing, 4 growers, which was a really good test of the crop. So it's relatively small scale, but what everybody says is if we could build the factory, if we could build the processing facility, and if we got commitment from the market, it could spread pretty quickly. We could have a viable industry.
Yeah, and I think, well, both you and I have sort of modelled investment in capital for processing. I think it's fair to say that, I mean, we are looking at developing a complete supply chain potentially. And we are talking about trying to find and develop markets, not only for fibre, but for shiv. So there are a lot of components that need to come together. And like you say, it's a bit chicken and egg in terms of there are new products coming onto the market, but they have to go through all the legal processes of conformity, and they have to be priced correctly to compete with comparative products or the products that they're replacing. So there are a lot of things that need to fit into place, and we will still be working with growers through 2026. We're going to undertake a study looking particularly at how you valorize the shiv element of the crop. Because actually, when we were doing the modelling, although the shiv output is less valued than the fibre, as you said, sort of 60% of the output is shiv. So in terms of income from sales from fibre products and shiv products, the shiv products potentially could have 50% of the value of your total output. So let's just perhaps talk about the crop itself. I think we've had a couple of years' experience growing the crop with the farmers in the Scottish borders here. As you say, we had about 60 hectares grown in 2025, and we're still looking at getting that crop processed. For the benefit of those people that might be interested in considering hemp in the rotation, let's just perhaps recap on what we learned in growing the crop. I had some variety trials back at SRUC, Easter Howgate, and actually on 2 other sites back in 2024, and we were looking at different varieties. And I think the take-home message from those variety trials was that Futura 75 was the one that most people are opting for, and I think that's the one Nick grows down in East Yorkshire. Seems to respond best to fertiliser, and looking at the response rates to increasing fertiliser rates, it seemed to have the best response curve. So we tried other varieties, ISO and Xanthica. So there are a limited number of varieties out there, but Futura seemed to be the one that we were going for. And we are talking about fibre as opposed to seed. And I suppose a distinction to make just before, because we have got seed growers in the country. The seed varieties are probably less tall and more bushy. There's more of an emphasis on the seed crop as opposed to the fibre element. So we are talking about fibre varieties in this podcast and the management of fibre crops, hemp grown for fibre. So let's go back. So let's pretend we're back in the spring. What were your sort of few take-home messages about establishment and successful establishment? There was quite a lot around soil temperature, wasn't there, and cultivation?
There was, yes. Because one of the most critical things, there's 2 fairly critical things. You don't want to grow in a hemp crop in waterlogged soil. It doesn't like in too wet at the start of the season, but it does need moisture. And secondly, you need a reasonably warm seed bed. And by that, we're talking about around 10 degrees Celsius. So we're really looking at that early on, and we need a reasonably fine seed bed as well so that the crop can get away. A power harrow can usually do enough about that. I'll pass back to you, Mark, about drilling rates and things like that.
Yeah, because so the growers that put in crop this year, and actually Ian Fullerton, who grew the crop in 2024 as well, tended to be really the first 2 weeks of May before soil temperatures got up to, as you say, 10. and ideally probably 12 or 14 degrees C. I think we all opted to drill at 40 kgs per hectare. Seed is relatively expensive. I think we paid about £8 to £9 a kilo. So that's probably the most expensive variable cost. So yeah, wait till the soils warm up. And I think you really look at drilling it like all seed rape. So it doesn't really want to go in any deeper than a centimetre. If you are direct drilling, it probably needs to be in the right type of soils, because it doesn't like capping. And actually, some of the advice we've received is to try and avoid drilling if you know there's heavy rain coming in the next 10 days, because the crop will fail to germinate if the soil caps over. So our crops established well, both in 2024 and 25. Fertilizer, we think about 100 to 125 kgs if you're sort of following cereals, typically with a low N index. The feedback I've got is that it's more potash hungry than it is phosphate hungry. So the recommendation seems to be about 80 kgs of phosphate and 140 kgs of potash. Fertilizer goes on after the crops emerged, and we're really looking at about 100 to 100 day growing period. So if we're drilling in the first 2 weeks of May, then we're really looking to cut the crop in early to mid-August. And as growers are sort of aware of the autumn rains coming in October, the desire is to get the crop cut and baled and have the ability to put in winter wheat in September, really, ideally before October comes. We can touch on that a bit in this conversation we're having now. So we've got the crop growing. We get to early August. Most growers, well, there actually isn't any active herbicide substances that are allowed to be applied. And if the crop's established and growing away well, it'll smother out any weed competition. So really our main costs are seed and fertilizer. And the fertilizer regime for nitrogen is not dissimilar to spring barley at 100, 110 kgs of N. So do you want to explain a bit about what the retting process and actually how we got on in 2025 with what was quite a difficult year, wasn't it, for getting the crop off the field?
Retting's a very important thing. Well, there's two important parts to growing industrial hemp, and one is your cutting date. You want to cut it at early flowering or before the crop starts flowering too much. And you cut it. Ideally, you would chop it into smaller lengths. So what we got was a 3-bar cutter with 3 bars at different heights, which were probably giving us about cuts of about 1 metre apart. You can also do it with a forage harvester, as we saw in the Netherlands, and then leave it in the swath. You don't need to turn it too often, but it's best to turn it once or twice, and then to allow it all to dry out. But it's not about drying. This isn't a hay crop. What you're really wanting is the microbes to break down the lignin within the material. So you're separating the fibre from the shiv. That's the most important thing. And then last summer, we actually had a dry spell for 3 weeks in August, and no retting took place because it was too dry. So you actually need a bit of moisture to do that. And then after that, we got too much moisture, which was a little bit of a plan. Normally, you'd say 4 to 6 weeks in the field, and it'll be dry enough. Get it in a fine day and get it rowed up and ready for the baler. But last year was a bit of a nightmare, and it just took a long time to get to the baling stage. We also had a wind, a storm Floris, was it, in July, that had brackled a number of the stems. And although they're very tough, they still can brackle over in a strong wind. And that left us with fairly long stalks, which started to wrap around the baler intake because they were a wee bit damper, some of them, than we really would have wanted. But eventually, by trial and error, overcome that and got removed tines and got the right baler used. And it went fine. It went fine after that. But yes, it was a pretty difficult season, as opposed to the previous one when Ian Fullerton had a pretty dry September and a good baling period.
Yeah, I mean, this year the crops were noticeably taller than, well, I say this year, the crop grown in 2025 was noticeably taller than the crop in 2024, wasn't it? And probably 8 feet tall, would you have said?
Or more. It was above 10 foot in some of the farms. And because it can grow a phenomenal amount every day. And we got such a fantastic warm summer last year that gave us big crops. I think we probably lost a little bit of yield in the field, but the biggest crop was 7.5 tons to the hectare.
Yes, and I think when we sort of were doing our budgeting, we were looking at probably, I don't know, was it 6 tons a hectare? I think it does seem to be very dependent on the weather and the amount of sunlight you get in that sort of 100-day growing period. But you mentioned the storm, and of course with those sort of 10, 12-foot crops snapping off halfway, some of the stems were snapping and laying horizontally. We ended up obviously with a horizontal cutter blade. Some of those stems were going through being uncut or considerably longer than a meter, and it was that sort of wrapping that gave us issues. And as time goes on, I mean, we went to Europe and we saw them using a modified forager with a cutter on the front that actually left the material in a windrow. And even now, we're looking at other ways of cutting the crop, not dissimilar to how flax is cut, although we're not actually, the flax machine is actually pulling the flax out of the ground, but there is a variation of that machine which actually will cut and lay hemp on the ground, which can then be fed in the correct orientation into a decortication machine.
One of the most important things at the baling stage is to get the moisture content low, below 15%. We have to do that for it to go through the processing equipment. And thereafter, after it's baled, and generally we've been using big square bales because they're better for transport. They're more efficient for transport and for storage rather than big round bales. You could use either. You must not let any water get onto that crop. So get it out of the field and under cover, preferably in a storage shed that's got 4 solid sides and there's no water gets into it. And when it's moved in lorries, we have to make sure they're either curtain siders or very well sheeted, because you just can't afford anything to go in. If it's moist at all, it's going to bung up the equipment at the processor, and it could take hours to get that stuff out of his line. So
when we're talking about decortication and processing the hemp, let's just touch on the sort of emerging markets that are out there. And well, there are some more established markets than others, and there are some new products that are being developed. But predominantly, the fibre is used for insulation bats. The shiv historically has gone for sort of pet bedding and horse bedding. There's growth into hempcrete, but there's also growth into perhaps denser boards that might potentially replace plasterboard. Have you got any other insights, Ian, as to potential uses other than products like sort of textiles and paper that really we're not going to be touching on?
Well, this is what's really good about the hemp crop, is that it's got so many uses. They used to say it had 4 main uses, and that was food, fibre, oil, and medicine. And to that, you can add construction, you can add land reclamation, you can add paper. The list is almost endless. And such a versatile crop. And I've just noted down, you've got the construction uses, which we've just mentioned, the insulation panels. It's a breathable material. Hemp's a fairly breathable material. It regulates moisture within a building, and it's a great insulation material. So it can be cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And it's quite breathable as well. It's an excellent material to use in retrofits if you've got a stone wall and you don't want damp in a house. And it's also good for building new houses, new homes, because you could have insulation bats and these compressed boards round about them, and all you need to provide is the timber for the frame of your house. You can use hempcrete. Hempcrete, which is the shiv, is mixed with a lime binder, and you can either use it in a shuttered sort of way. So you've got two shutters either side. You mix up all the hempcrete, you pour it in. You might have seen this in Grand Designs when there was a recent program about a lady in Wales who did it. And it's quite a niche thing for the contractor to do, I would say, because it's a little bit messy and it's slow and it takes time, but it gives an absolutely beautiful finish, and it's a fantastic material. If there's a way of speeding that up, that would be great. And maybe there is, because there are companies that make hemp blocks or hempcrete blocks. So if you could just build these blocks one on top of the other, that would be good. In addition to that, there's the textile use. You need the finest hemp fibre to make textile materials, or you need to process it quite heavily later on. And there is definitely a market there emerging. Then there's manufacturing. You can make anything using a kind of binder or a resin and hemp fibre, because we saw chairs that have been made out. We saw panels that go onto cars. I think Mercedes, Bugatti use hemp fibres in their panels.
Corrugated sheeting for roofs with bioresins.
Sheeting for roofs, floors. There's a lot of advantages. And the great thing about this material is that you're capturing carbon for whatever the life of that building is. It could be 60, 80, 100 years. So it's a lot. If you look at the carbon cycle, it's a lot better than using concrete. And you can actually make beams out of it, because hemp fibers can be used to reinforce other materials. So the list is almost endless. When we talk about animal bedding, we've got horse bedding's probably one of the big markets, and pet bedding. So this is just a shiv, which is then hammer milled into this other material.
Yeah, and that's before you talk about things potentially like biochar or bioplastics. I've seen sort of hemp pelletized for use in the bioplastic industry. Yes, I mean it is fascinating. And you mentioned carbon. We haven't. I don't really think that the carbon cycle's been monetarized as yet, but I think everyone's aware that there's potentially sort of 10 to 15 tons of CO2 absorbed per hectare for hemp harvested, and that's something that might appeal to farmers in terms of their carbon footprint further down the line. So yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a wide list of potential uses. Was there one other that you wanted to allude to?
It'd be wrong not to mention the seed part of the industry, because that's potentially quite strong in Scotland as well, where the seeds can be used, and you can cold press the seeds to provide an oil which is very pure and high quality. It's got properties equally as good as olive oil, and probably better. It's higher in omega-6 and omega-9. It's got a fairly high protein content, a high fiber content, and good fats. And what you do is you can crush the seed to extract the oil, and you're left with hemp cake. And you can use that hemp cake for human nutrition. It could go for animal nutrition, fish, whatever. And you also got a thing called hemp hearts, where you take the seed and you dehull it, and you're left with, the seed part of it, which is a very good additive to food. And hemp flour, interestingly, is gluten-free. So there's an awful lot about this hemp crop. I was going to add, You can also buy hemp underpants and hemp socks. So it does everything.
Yeah, so if you want to find out more about the seed elements and the benefits of the seed from the hemp crop, Wendy Russell at the Rowett Institute is doing a lot of work with some growers in Scotland, Ali Eason at Hemp It Up and Martin Sessford to name but just a couple. And we can put those contact details in the show notes if anybody would like to speak to the Rowett and Wendy there. So we talked about the different products. We've touched on carbon. Phytoremediation is another one that keeps cropping up. Do you want to give a bit of background about what people have been alluding to in that field, Iain, with regards to soil management?
We found that hemp is an excellent crop to grow on contaminated sites because it's got a deep tap root between 1.5 and 2.5 meters deep and quite long lateral roots as well. So it's great for soil structure, but it also extracts heavy metals out. And it absorbs some of them into the roots and some are taken up into the plant as well. And it has been proven to be a great way of clearing these sites because you can go in and harvest the crop on a regular basis and remove the contamination from an industrial zone that's heavily contaminated. And there seems to be a lot of interest in that at the moment, and quite a lot of papers have been written about it. From a farmer's point of view, it's great to have a crop with such a deep tap root because it opens up the porosity of the soil. It gives you far better structure and drainage and water flow. And we've found that successive crops tend to benefit from round about 10%. Some people say 8%, 10%, 15%. So a wheat crop after a hemp crop could benefit from an additional 10% yield, which is not to be forgotten.
Yeah. And I think, just going back to the carbon, I think some people were asking, well, what of that sort of carbon sequestered by the crop, what sort of is retained in the soil? And I think it's about 20%. That seems to be the go-to figure. And I suppose that's by virtue of the fact that you've probably not got something dissimilar to 20% as the dry matter of the crop remaining in the soil in terms of root mass and root ball. Interestingly enough, it's a crop that flowers and produces pollen at a time of year, sort of July to September weather, where is very little other pollen around. It does produce a large amount of pollen, so there's another sort of biodiversity benefit there as a nutritional source for bees during that period of floral pollen scarcity. Well, it's been great talking to you, Iain. I hope we've been able to convey some of what we've learned. Both you and I, I'm sure, will be willing and enjoy taking any queries from listeners, should they have any, having listened to what we've been talking about. We didn't actually have time to touch too much on the decortication and processing, but maybe when we give an update, perhaps later in the year or next year, we can touch more on the processing side of it as to what's involved in separating the fibre out from the shiv. But we'll put our email addresses in the show notes, and if anybody would like to follow up with a conversation to either of us, you're more than welcome to. Thanks for joining us, Iain. It's been good to speak to you as always. And no doubt we'll be speaking again shortly during the course of our further work on the subject.
No doubt, Mark. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Bye. Thanks for joining us for this episode of CropCast Conversations. And if you are interested to learn more about hemp, there is a link in the show notes to a report that Iain and I were involved in, and it's called Advancing a Sustainable Scottish Supply Chain for Industrial Hemp and Co-Products, and it's certainly worth a read. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, you may enjoy some of our other Farm Advisory Service podcasts. This podcast was presented by me, Mark Boucher-Gibbs, produced by Heather Stewart, edited by Cameron Waugh, with executive producers Kirsten Blackwood and Kerry Hammond. Come back next time for more CropCast Conversations.
The Farm Advisory Service podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.